This week, we're talking retail prices, supply and demand, and consumer sentiment. Hello, I'm Meghan Grebner, host of the weekly Livestock Market update on Brownfield. With us, as always, to talk all things markets, University of Missouri, Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Our program again is brought to you by the Feedstuff Finder from the University of Missouri. Feedstuff Finder was developed by the University of Missouri Extension with funds provided from the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center and the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. All right, before we get into reports, let's talk about markets this week, which definitely have had a more negative undertone to them on the cattle side.
Yeah, that's right, Megan. If we start on the cattle side, live fed cattle were down about $3.10 this week. Those feeder cattle markets were also lower, anywhere from $2 to $5 lower this week. On the future side, the June live cattle futures contract closed down 55 cents this week, and the May feeder cattle contract was down $4.40. That's almost a $20 decline in feeder cattle futures over the last 3 weeks. Choice box beef was also lower, down about 85 cents this week. On the hog side, it's the other side of the picture here. So cash barrels and gilts, $3.60 higher this week. The June lean hog futures contract was down hard, down $5.85 for the week. The pork cutout value gained $3.85. Hams and bellies, as well as loins and butts, all were stronger this week.
On the cattle side of things, I feel like the conversation is what goes up must eventually come down at some point. As you think about this long term, do you think this is more of a short-term correction and allows us to kick things back up again, knowing where we are in terms of supplies and what's been happening in terms of herd?
It sure looks like to me that as supplies continue to tighten here in 2024, we could talk about a return to some higher prices again. And let's remember, although we were down $3.10, we're still talking about roughly $1.84 fed cattle this week. Those are pretty lofty prices. I think the thing that I like to remind us, when you look at choice box beef, we're now setting $2 and roughly $2.40 above where we were a year ago. And on the pork side, we're setting $23.50 above where we were a year ago. So it really talks about the difference of where we sit. And those cattle prices, again, I think when you're at record levels, the downside risk is certainly there for corrections, sharp and quick. It doesn't mean we won't come back from where we've been, and we'll just have to see just how tight we get this summer.
All right, let's talk slaughter numbers as we take a look at cattle and hogs, hog slaughter numbers. How are we running compared to last week and a year ago?
Yeah, so on the cattle side this week, for the week ending April 13th, USDA set a run of 603,000 head of cattle. That is down 10,000 head from what we ran a week ago, down 8,000 head from where we ran 1 year ago. On the hog side, a little bigger run this week, 2.485 million head of hogs this week. That was 64,000 above where we were a week ago and 58,000 above where we were a year ago.
As we talk about those year-over-year comparisons, we definitely are going in opposite directions.
We are. So cattle slaughter year to date down now 5.1%. We've been coming back a little bit from being down even more. On the hog slaughter side, we're up 0.7% so far year to date.
All right, let's talk retail prices as we take a look at those numbers. Let's start with beef. How are we running compared to last month, and also thinking about prices relative to a year ago?
Yeah, so if you look for the March 2024 choice retail beef price, $8.12 a pound. That was up just roughly about 4 cents from where we were in February, but it is 6.3% above the same period a year ago. So higher prices, not surprising. We're seeing those higher prices on the beef side.
And on the pork side of things?
Yeah, so a little different story here. So $4.79 when you look at the pork retail price, for March. That's just 3 cents above where it was in February. That's it's 0.8% higher than it was a year ago. For me, the interesting thing out of the pork side of the equation, when you look at pork chops in particular, they were up 3.4% this month relative to last month. So much of the strength in the overall pork retail price wasn't due to bacon, which we've been talking about a lot, due to pork chops this month.
When we look at what these prices, where these prices are, where they have been, we also, and I know we're going to talk consumer sentiment coming up in a little bit, but thinking about the economy and inflation, that's been a little bit stubborn. Are we starting to see a pullback in consumption of meat products ever so slightly, or are we starting to see any substitution in terms of maybe less expensive cuts of meat to maybe stretch our grocery dollar a little bit more?
So I'll say to number one, to consumption, we may see lower consumption. I'm not sure we're seeing lower demand yet, which is really a good sign, just given where prices are today. You know, when you look at what's $8.12 choice retail beef price. All right, so number one, don't forget June of last year, we were at $8.14. So consumers $8.30 in July of last year. So consumers have been paying higher prices for beef, and I think are used to it. I guess the thing that seems to have caught attention is the cost of fast food these days. And perhaps that's more of a sign of even what we might think of as some of the lower valued beef products may start to see some substitution. But it's hard because all of the meat prices certainly are moving higher, maybe not at the record levels like beef is currently at, but it's hard to find a lot of great substitution items in that mix.
I think interesting talking about more of a flat, month to month in terms of like the grocery price inflation or index, right? Like we didn't see much change from February to March, but we sure are seeing a difference in the cost of food away from home show up, and not there's no reprieve there right now.
Yeah. So if you look at the first few months here, so food service gone up 5.5% and grocery store prices up 1.2. I think that points to maybe some of the labor side of this equation that continues to push costs higher for those in the restaurant business.
All right, let's talk supply and demand numbers. As you take a look at the April report from USDA, talk to me about what your takeaway was, because if we're talking livestock, obviously different than what was a little bit boring of a supply and demand on the corn and soybean side of things.
Yeah, that's right. So USDA made some changes for the April report. I'd like to start with, so you take beef, pork, and chicken production. They raised all three of the 2024 estimates together. It's 533 million pound increase from March to April in terms of the increase for 2024. So more supplies. When you look at the export side, so although we talk about a reduction in chicken exports, pork exports, 210 million pound increase in 2024 pork exports. That certainly is one of the positives. I'll say across the board, a $2 increase in fed steers, barrows and gilts, and chicken prices just reminds me to say, even with growing supplies, higher prices implies to me demand still fairly good, and USDA thinks that will continue for 2024.
It's really a pretty positive indication thinking about higher price estimates. And also if we're talking about higher pork prices, to have an expectation that pork exports are going to remain strong and continue to be a bright spot for that sector?
We have certainly seen some nice recovery after what was kind of a tough start to 2024 on the hog side, and exports may be what pull us here at the end of the day and keep prices higher.
I feel like domestic demand on the pork side of things is also showing some strength. How much is that like seasonality going into summer grilling season, or is that just it's an easy pickup at the grocery store and we know what to do with it?
Yeah, so I think there is a little bit of summer grilling here. I think compared to other times of year, people may not think about pork in that mix as much. I would agree with you. I don't think there's anything that's wrong with pork demand domestically. I think the export side's just been so warm of late that it's easy to focus on that's what's driving us. But it's not like it's weak domestic demand for pork, especially this year relative to 2023.
All right. Consumer sentiment is our last official thing we're going to talk about in terms of report. I've got some questions for you when we wrap up. Talk me through the April index.
Yeah, so the April index was down 1.9% relative to March. I think, we're looking at a current economic conditions portion of that index that was down 3.9. So consumers maybe worried a little bit about overall inflation as we continue to see that kind of top of mind, and the discussion about when do interest rates move down, if they move down in 2024. I think all of that's led to some of the uncertainty in that current conditions index. However, I want to make sure we stay focused on, when you look at the overall index of consumer sentiment relative to a year ago, it's still 22.3% higher.
Interesting. We have talked about the Fed has made some indications or has signaled that like we'll see some slowing, maybe some pullback, right? Is inflation proving to be maybe a little stubborn right now?
Well, so certainly I think some would say that's the case. I continue to say we are slowing the rate of inflation. Perhaps the last point or two that we're trying to shave off here will be the hardest. And I think that's kind of where we might be at right now. And I will say it's important to remember, although we're slowing inflation, it's not like we're talking about prices that are moving lower. So we'll see how consumer behavior is. I think this is the balancing act of, can wages, real wages, continue to move higher if we continue to experience longer periods of inflation, and does that keep meat demand strong for us? Those are the things that I think are key on that domestic demand side.
All right. As we wrap up today, I think we can't not talk about this USDA announced this week. It was suspending some reports. It was canceling some other reports. One of those in that category is the July cattle inventory report. As an economist, so put on your, not like you haven't been wearing your economist hat, but like officially put on your economist hat. How concerning is it, knowing what's going on in terms of the cattle industry and the cattle cycle, that we lose this July report that has, I don't know, indications of calf crops? What's happening overall in the industry?
Yeah, so I always say I want more information, not less information. The July report has not been as important as the January report. However, when you think about where we're sitting in the cycle right now, there's so much discussion about when are we going to start growing? When are we going to see the cow herd try to expand? Missing the July data is potentially problematic if we try to start to grow as we go further here the next few months. We don't get then good survey information until January 1 of 2025. A lot could have changed over that period of time that we miss. Now, this is not the first time we've not had a July cattle report. But I would certainly be in favor of somehow trying to make sure it continues as we look ahead. And again, I just worry about the lack of information, because now, Megan, we're going to only have two pieces of the puzzle here to think about beef cows in particular, and that's beef cow slaughter and percentage of heifers on feed once a quarter. Those are good indicators of what's happening to the beef cow side, but I'd much rather have some survey data.
Is it also problematic thinking about this in terms of, I mean, we'll go January to January, so to not have that information, and then thinking about where even we're seeing some expansion in different parts of the country to be able to kind of flesh out some of that information as well. I guess not just because out of habit, we like to have this information, but it serves a purpose. And I worry about the disservice for producers in the long run.
Yeah. All right. So I always go, the simple answer I have to this is that if we aren't publicly getting that data available, someone privately will try to take advantage of the lack of public information, and they may know more about what's coming in terms of supplies than producers might know. And that puts producers in a tough spot, not knowing exactly what's coming. So I'll say more information. And to your point about regionally, it matters. Who's growing? What parts of the country are growing? How does weather affect whether some parts of the U.S. will try to grow more quickly than others? Missing that information could certainly lead to poor decisions by producers who are trying to decide whether to expand their herd or not.
Well, it remains to be seen what happens. We have a couple of months until potentially there's a change. As we look ahead to next week, cattle on feed, what are you watching for in terms of that report?
Yeah, so I think it's the same old story on cattle on feed of, what happens, number one, to on feed inventory. Are we going to start to see any signs yet of feed yards not being full? And then second, what happens to placements? We've certainly started the year with some awkward, I guess is the way I would phrase it. January being very cold, I think postponed some placements into February. So it made January and February, I think, look different than otherwise would be the case. So getting more information about that placement number will be the key piece of this report again.
Scott, always great to see you. We'll talk to you next Friday.
Sounds good, Megan.
So our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning. Go to brownfieldagnews.com. You can click subscribe. You can also submit questions and comments if you have them. And for a rundown of what happens every day in the market, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute, not just in the afternoon, but the mornings now as well. Have a great weekend. I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.